times we rush, and whether it's a path system or another system, we need to make sure that we look to see why were they created, are they meeting the needs, instead of just grabbing and using certain social safety nets. Because remember, as we move towards indirect tax, there will be at some, the rich consume more, but the poor do consume. So we have to ensure that to the extent you're taking money away from the poor and giving it back to them, it's done so efficiently, fairly, and drives economic growth. In terms of the report, though, Dr. King, I must say it is good to see good research done and moving it in the direction of support for indirect taxes. As you know, we can nitpick, we can talk about which countries should have been there, which countries shouldn't have been there, but at the end of the day, it is moving in the right direction. And for me, I really would love to see us with a tax system that encourages growth. That's it.
Thank you, Alison. And moving along to Mrs. Folks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. King, thank you very much for inviting the Minister of Finance to participate in this forum. When we looked at the report, first of all, we want to congratulate you for the report, a very good report. The ministry had some problems in terms of how the benchmarks that you used, in terms of not using more LAC countries, but moving towards the OECD countries. But then we have to know where we want to be and where we want to benchmark ourselves. So if we want to benchmark ourselves on first world countries, at least we know what the gap is and how to get there. So that was, for us at the ministry, one of the critiques, but overall a very good report. Over the years, Jamaica has been moving towards indirect taxation. In fact, the move started as far back as 1991 when we created the VAT system, which is what we call our GCT. The GCT, Dr. King, in your presentation, you mentioned that we have exemptions or waivers within the VAT system or the VAT system. But when we look at it, what are the exemptions that we currently have in our tax system? They're not much. Not much. Basic food items, we're talking about bare bones food items, school supplies, and medical supplies. So Jamaica has been moving towards eliminating zero-rated items. We have been moving towards cleaning up the VAT system. And in fact, we're going to be further looking at the VAT system to ensure that we take out all the different, because now you realize that we have different rates. We have a rate, a basic standard rate of 16.5%, which applies to almost everything. There is a rate for tourism, which is 10%, and we also have a rate for telephone services, which is 25%. So in the next phase of the reform, we're looking towards having a better VAT system, meaning we're moving towards indirect taxation. We're also going to be looking at the income tax. Currently, our income tax rate is 25% for unregulated companies, but companies who pay their employees taxes on time, file and pay on time, will be able to have a further reduction in the income tax rate. And also, when we look at the corporate income tax in relation to regulated entities, they are still at 33.33%. So Jamaica is moving towards indirect taxation. Over the last 2 budget years, you saw where the personal income tax threshold was increased to 1.5 million, almost a 200% jump. Why? Because more money is going into the pockets, more persons are able to work because they're being taxed less. We see where the take for GCT is increasing in terms of when you look at GCT as a percentage of GDP, the figures for GCT is increasing over time, while you see the figures for income tax moving down. So overall, Jamaica is, I believe, on the right trajectory. As Alice has said, when you look at the PATH program or looking at the expenditure side, yes, the tax system will not cure all the ills. There is the expenditure side to look at, but we have to realize that we need to ensure that it is targeted enough so the right persons benefit. Again, from where the ministry sits, a very good research overall, and your team are to be congratulated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Folks. And we'll have Mr. Williams from TAJ give his response.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Let me firstly, on behalf of Tax Administration Jamaica, express thanks to Capri for the invitation to be here and the opportunity to have been able to partner with you on this study, which I think is a very good one. Having examined the report, we do concur that the ability to extract tax is one of the critical and the fundamental tools in order to drive economic development. We are also cognizant as Tax Administration Jamaica of the 4 cost factors that you have identified. And coming on the heels of that, we're happy to see that the tax gap has decreased, as you have indicated, which is very good because we have implemented mandatory e-filing for GCT. And I think this also shows our look as a tax administration, forward-looking, in terms of to look at how we reduce compliance costs and other factors. But in terms of how we have looked on the report, we're also happy to see that the report has pointed to the fact that we need to look at the relevant tax gaps that are there and also look at efficiency, because our Tax Administration Jamaica, we have done tremendous work in terms of to ensure that there is efficiency. We have looked at a queuing system which we have implemented a few days ago in our new Falmouth office. We have started a pilot in terms of how is that we're going to roll it out across all offices that we have. We have at Constance Spring now. So it's a very good way in terms of how we are going to try to remove the traffic that is being spoken about and to reduce the time in which we take to do business. I'd also like to highlight that we have not lost sight of the fact that as a tax administration, efficiency is key, and we have implemented our revenue administration system from 2015. And I'm happy to say that from we have introduced our system in 2015, we have met our revenue target. We have this year, for the first time in our history, passed the revenue target for each month. And it is incumbent on the fact that we have utilized the third-party information which we have in-house, and we have used it as a source on which we can identify taxpayers to which we need to bring into the net, one, and we have also used it as to broaden the base. So for us, we are very happy for this study, and we will continue to work with Capri in terms of ensuring that the best and most efficient tax system is implemented for Jamaica. Thank you.
Okay, so from my end, Slido seems to be working, and I would encourage you to go on it, because one of the fun things about Slido is that you can vote up questions. So if you see a question you like, you can vote for it, and it then moves to the top of my list. So I haven't seen anybody doing that, but we do have some very good questions here. So I'm going to just take 1 or 2 from here to get the ball rolling. And I'm going to just give one to Damien that he can answer. It's just a straight-out methodology question. And then I'll put the other question to the rest of the panel. So Damien, the question is, how did you determine the level of the informal sector? Then the question for the rest of the panel is about property tax and what recommendations can be made about property tax specifically. Currently, the government has to take legal action against non-compliant individuals, and is there a better way to enforce that?
Thank you. There are many, over the decades, there have been many studies that looked at estimating the size of the informal sector in Jamaica, and it used various techniques. In this case, to get something that was up to date, we simply used the labor force survey. And the labor force survey reports in quite detail, how each person is employed, what their activities are. And so we simply took the share of employment that was in informal activities and expressed it as a percentage of the total employed labor force. But the 41% that comes out at actually aligns with many of the previous studies looking at the size of the informal sector.
I was actually supposed to allow Rohan to say his question specifically about property tax. Rohan, I don't know if you want to identify yourself? Okay, so the question was about property tax. Alison, you want to start with that one?
Sure. You know, what's interesting, when you look at other countries and their level of property tax, I'm going to be controversial. We line up to get visas to the US and Canada, and we pay their property taxes, which are higher. But in Jamaica, the government has to pursue a lot of us because we don't really pay as much attention to the property tax. Now, when I look at the rate of property taxes and what we expect from it, I think it's too low. No, I'm being blunt. We like to complain about our level of taxation, and we don't look to see, are we getting what we pay for? But if we pay more, can we get better service? So if you look at the fact that your property tax, if you were to immigrate and see what you would pay. So for example, in Canada, your property tax depends on which province you're in, and it's a lot higher than what you would pay in Jamaica. You will argue that you get better garbage collection, you get better roads, you can argue a lot of that, but it's a chicken and the egg. Which comes first? When you pay for it or the compliance? So my concern is the rate of property tax, as the study here has shown, is quite low in terms of when you compare it to the OECD and countries that Jamaicans like to immigrate to. The issue of compliance and collecting property tax, it goes right across the border. It seems to be a behavior. We don't like to pay. We take forever to pay. It's something that we need to change, and we need to change from our children going up in terms of financial literacy and ensuring that we pay. I don't know if maybe the tax collectors need to go on the credit bureau so that you can't get light and water, or you can't buy a TV and buy your court things. So that may be another way to look, because to go to court is draconian, it's costly. And when you come back to what the study says, are you getting value for buck? You know, so what you pay for, does it make sense to hire a lawyer? People complain about the fees of, for the lawyers. So I am putting it out there that, to be honest, I think the rate is low, but we as a country don't tend to pay anything as we should. So we need a cultural shift, and perhaps that will change.
Damien?
If I may add to that point, notwithstanding that Estonia and New Zealand are able to collect 33 and 34% of GDP in tax revenue, Jamaica, which currently is close to 28%, is at the global average. Further, we have a balanced fiscal budget, and I've pretty much had that for 5 years. So when in this forum we talk about a tax being too low and should be higher, you are to interpret that as mean property tax being higher and replacing something else. It means lower income tax or lower GCT.
Correct.
And in that regard, let me add a part of the study that was not in the presentation. There are actually 4 costs of taxation. I spoke about 3 of them, and the report estimates 3 of them: evasion, compliance, administration. But the 4th cost is distortion, the extent to which a tax motivates citizens to reduce the taxed activity and pursue some other activity, expenditure, production that is less desirable. It distorts what people do, and that's a real cost. We didn't estimate it because it really is too difficult to estimate. But when we take distortion into account, property tax, and in particular, the way property tax is calculated in Jamaica, which is essentially a land tax, and we don't care what is the value of anything on top of the land, which is the way to do property taxes, then our property tax is the least distorting of all the taxes because the amount of land is not going to change because it is taxed. So taking the cost of distortion into account and the international comparison to which Alison referred, our property taxes are indeed too low. And property taxes could be higher to allow us to have lower income taxes and perhaps lower GCT.
Mrs. Fox, on the hot seat.
Just following up on property tax. Property tax has been property tax has been in the news for a little while now as we grapple with trying to find the best rate to fit with the most recent unimproved valuation that was done. And for Jamaica, we chose to use a very low rate. The property, as Dr. King says, the property is not moving, it's not going anywhere. But we still have a problem with compliance. When you look at a compliance rate of 52%, and we have pushed, we have pulled, we have gone out in terms of public education to get persons to pay with their property taxes, because property taxes do not go to the consolidated fund. They go directly to the parish council. They're used to fund garbage collection, street lights. If we want, as Alistair said, if we want better amenities, persons must pay. So the whole matter is really compliance, because the rate is low, the unimproved value is relatively low, but we find that the take-up, so I believe it's just a matter of choice, how persons view the land, or perhaps just the value that they place on it. So it is one of the taxes, I would call it one of the baby taxes, or the very small tax. It contributes very little to GDP, but it has, in terms of the work that it must do to make Jamaica beautiful, it plays a large role.
Thank you very much. I do concur with Pam that although public taxes account for approximately 4% of the total tax revenue, is a critical tax. And what we have done with the support of the Ministry of Finance is to implement a project that will give us the ability to concentrate on property tax as an important revenue source for the local authorities. Coming out of that, we have realized, though, and that will be post the data that has been used in this study, that there are some properties which need to be removed from the roll, and we have started work to remove. We have removed approximately 2,000 of those properties from the roll, which are properties, for example, churches, which should be exempted, those related to the Commissioner of Lands, and UDC. All those are off. So that is why we have recognized that there is a need for adjustment, although we had set out initially to have a compliance rate of moving from 52 to 84%, that the base will need to be adjusted, and that in of itself will I think negate some of the figures that we have there in terms of the tax gap. Additionally, we have recognized that in addition to cleaning the road, there is need also for to look at public education. There is a move afoot to employ persons who are in the HOPE program to assist us with a part of the public education campaign, because, for example, properties that are close to statue bar, to ensure that we do the collections. We have seen when we do year on year that there is an improvement in terms of the collection rate, but we want to ensure that for those properties for which would have gone arrears by 1 or 2 years, that we ensure that we close the revenue gap there. Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask another controversial question? If you don't pay your property tax and the land isn't going anywhere, why is it never seized? So I'm being bad in that, to be honest with you, sometimes we're nicey with people when they don't pay not just property taxes, but you know, when people owe you money, how many of us go and get draconian?
doctor before we can answer that one.
You say what, bad? You're asking me? You're asking him?
You want to try and take a stab at that one?
Hank.
Simply say that TJ, in its good wisdom, have not in any way shied away from taking persons to court to treat with non-compliance.
Then why is the compliance rate so low?
And I said, Dr. King, when I said post the data that we have had, we realized that the rule needs to be cleaned up, and we are actually in the process of doing the data cleaning. Because again, for example, I said exempt properties, churches, the government lands which need to be removed from the rules. So as soon as we have done that reconciliation, it will bring down actually the compliance gap that exists.
All right, so Richard Chen has a question who got lots of votes. So Richard, can you say your question yourself? Stand up so we can all hear you, please, Richard.
So my question was, how do custom duties factor into tax reform? And were they looked at as part of the research? How do custom duties factor into tax reform, and were they looked at as part of the research?
We omitted customs duties because that's a fourth category of taxation that we could have done the same analysis for, but we weren't able to get the data for customs duties that we could get for the others, and so we left out of the analysis. But there's no logical reason why it shouldn't have been analyzed on the same basis.
Yes. Okay, I can speak on what we have done with customs duties during the reform. In 2014, we passed a suite of legislation commonly known as the omnibus legislation. One of the pieces was the customs resolutions 1, 2, and 3. What those three pieces of documents did, they reduced some of the customs duty that Jamaica had control over that we could unilaterally reduce, given that we are a part of CARICOM. We reduced it from as high as 40 or 20% down to 5%, in some instances down to 0. We provided for the manufacturing sector, the hotel sector, and the creative sector for companies who import to be able to import raw material and intermediary goods without the payment of customs duty. All that took place January 1, 2014. And customs has reported an increase in collections. Jamaica, we have been meeting our revenue targets despite reducing customs duty. So we're seeing that persons are purchasing more, importing more. We're also looking at the increase in the increase in the US dollar in terms of how much customs duties we're getting, but at the same time, we also see that volume has increased at the ports.
Okay, we had asked people to put their names, and this question is anonymous, but it has been voted up by so many people, I'm going to let it go ahead. Does the person who asked about other countries successfully reducing their informal sector want to ask the question themselves? Or do you want to remain anonymous? Okay, so the question is to Dr. King, but I think that this is a valid question for everybody. In carrying out your research, did you come across any strategies that other countries have successfully employed to reduce the size of their informal sector?
Well, not in carrying out this research, but earlier this year, Capri did have a couple of forums and discussions on that precise question of what determines the size of an informal sector and what to do about it. And we had the great pleasure, in cooperation with the IDB, of inviting Dr. Santiago Levy to Jamaica. Really one of the world's leading experts on this question. And his research says that economies have large informal sectors because their regulations and taxes incentivize people to be informal. And he called particular attention to our social security taxes, NIS, and NHT, which most people don't view the return they get as a sufficient benefit to make the contributions. Most NHT contributors don't end up getting the benefit of a mortgage. Most contributors to NIS feel that by the time they are getting their Social Security, their pensions, it is worth a lot less than what they contributed. So those are simply taxes on formality. And so because we incentivize this employment to be formal, then we end up with a large informal sector. Consider this statistic, that if you were to add the hard trust contribution, education tax, income tax, NHT contribution, NIS, and you were to sum both the employee contribution and the employer contribution, the tax, the total tax on formal employment is 43.75%. If the tax on formal employment is 43.75%, it is no surprise that 40% of employment is informal. When we do what we are suggesting with income tax, then it is going to increase the amount of formality and decrease the amount of informality.
And have there been countries that have successfully done this?
I don't know the extent. We have not done a sort of before and after analysis of countries that have reduced their reliance on payroll taxes. But the payroll tax, the sum of payroll taxes in Jamaica, as I'm arguing, is extremely high.
Dr. King, just to point out that it is only the PAYE at 25% and the education tax that we say are taxes. Others are either contribution to benefits. Only the education tax and the PAYE.
People don't care what you call them.
They're deductions from your salary, but they do not go to the consolidated
Fine.
fund.
Can I make a comment? One of the things that I have noticed, I used to live overseas, and they also had an issue with the informal sector. Every country has an area of business where, for example, the construction sector, it's cash. A lot of countries find that they're of the view that wherever there's cash, people avoid tax. The other issue is whether it was the IRS or what is now coming as the sons and daughters of FATCA. Even the IRS, that everybody thinks people are so compliant, had to bring in that FATCA rule to go after its citizens that it was of the view was hiding money overseas. So another thing that I think will affect our informal economy, because informal, sometimes people think are the small guys. Some informal sectors are people who are earning a wage and also doing something on the side, because every Jamaican is an expert. They go to school for 4 years and they hang out a shingle and they're the expert. Do they pay the right tax? Do they pay their fair share? So we also have to realize that there's an informal economy with some people who are legitimate in other ways. But, right, so one of the things that we have to understand is coming. There's something called the Common Reporting Standard, whereby after the United States came with its FATCA, bank accounts globally there are over 100 countries that are now sharing information amongst each other with regards to when people put their banking info or they do things in various countries, whether they're the Cayman Islands, the Channel Islands, around the world. So another thing that is going to change with regards to Jamaica is with the advent of the OECD bringing in BEPS, there's a whole move afoot to be very transparent and share information. So when it comes to the informal sector, we're going to find information sharing is going to be important. But I also think it's not just a tax issue. When we have our banking sector, that if you're a small man, that, you know, if you cannot tell what your grandmother was buried in when they died 20 years ago to open a bank account, and not knocking the banks, I'm just saying what we're forced to do with proceeds of crime and you know, how we're viewed. It's very difficult if you want to get into the formal sector, if you're to show up in a bank and get into the banking system. So I think it's a two-pronged sword as well, in that if we don't get the unbanked banked, it will be very difficult for them to also. So it's quite complex. But I'm just giving you examples where hiding money overseas is not going to be the answer anymore, because everything is going to be told to TJ. Where, you know, but we as a country need to look at ways to get our informal persons who, you know, they're a gardener, they can't prove where they work, that we can open a bank account. It's easier to get them into the system and go after the dirty money than to keep everybody out because they can't prove who their grandmother was. So I think we do need some help in that regard.
Yes. Thank you, Alice. I'll build on what you have said. First, in TJ, there are various prongs that we have tried to close the gap, although the informal economy is increasing. We have seen, for example, during last financial year that we were able to collect data from 169 third-party sources, ranging from various business activities, which were able to register over 15,000 taxpayers. I would say for this financial year, we have set a target to register 8,000 taxpayers. We have gone 9,000 so far, new taxpayers that we have brought in based on the information that we have from various sources, ranging from the medical to the hotel sector. So we have been doing work in that regards. I'll concur with you, Alison, that the TAJ has seen a need based on our work in the international sphere to look at the base erosion, profit shifting, to look at the movement of profits across various countries, and again, with the introduction of the transfer pricing legislation that have borne a lot of fruit. I'll say to you that we have seen, for example, on our corporate income tax, when we introduced that piece of legislation, we got an additional $2 billion. So far, we have seen the major entities, their declarations are way in excess of what they were before. So we have seen a lot in that regard, and as we try to simplify the process in terms of our filing, we have ensured that we have mandatory channels have been increased, and we are trying to expand, as I said, our option to see how we can make it easier for persons to comply. So again, we are putting everything in place, despite the data showing that the informal economy is increasing. We are not going to give up in terms of ensuring that we bring persons into the net in order to broaden the base. Thank you.
I'm going to take two questions from the floor, one here, and then we'll take from Omar over there when he's finished.
Good evening. Dr. King, was there any consideration given to the effects of the CARICOM tax agreement on the leakage of tax, as setting up an IBC down in the Eastern Caribbean gives you enormous tax advantages, or essentially allows you to avoid paying tax except at a very nominal rate down there in the Eastern Caribbean?
That was not part of the parameters of this particular study, which was really quite narrow and specific to looking at the revenue potential of each of our existing tax types. But that's certainly something that might be looked into in the future.
Let me answer that in that with the base erosion profit shifting, after this year you cannot set up another IBC. So what you need to understand is the OECD is sweeping around the world and looking. There is going to be a grandfathering, but part of the issue is if you were now to set up a Barbados IBC today, you have a problem. So in terms of what the OECD did was it looked at various tax regimes. So we won't get into, I'll talk about the CARICOM treaty separately, but the issue of using IBCs came to the fore of the OECD, and they were blacklisted. So Barbados was on a blacklist, St. Lucia was on a blacklist, Trinidad was on a blacklist. for the IBC type regime that they had, and they had to promise to make changes to those systems. So in terms of the, I answered it or commented on it from an informal perspective. What is sweeping the world is the OECD and, particularly the European countries after the Panama Papers is of the view that people are hiding money in places and they're using tax structures to move things around. So to answer your question about the IBC, the time for the IBC, you're gonna see some changes occurring in CARICOM because of that initiative from the OECD, because to come off the blacklist, people had to change their tax regimes. Yeah. You only have 2 more years. No, you're not fine. There's a time, there's a grandfathering. So let's be clear. They drew us a line in the sand because taxation needs certainty. If you went somewhere and you set up an IBC, you can't just get rid of it within a certain time. So what Barbados and St. Lucia in particularly did was they agreed to grandfather and get rid of it. And you will see some changes to their tax system in a few years. So they've given them time to be able to adjust. What that means is Jamaica needs to wake up, because we could also have ourselves in a similar situation if we have these tax haven type legislation tucked away. So we also have to relook at our legislation, because depending on what our tax code says, as the OECD starts to roll out what they consider to be shifting of income out of high tax jurisdictions, they could be looking at Jamaica and saying, you have this ring-fenced tax system that is giving a lower tax. So it's tiptoeing through the raindrops. But that's why I said we need a tax system for growth. Because one of the problems is the Panama Papers, the push from the US to say, look, money is moving out. And let's be clear, the US, from a corporate perspective, dropped its rate. So the differential around the Caribbean, in a few years, the landscape is going to change. Unless the OECD abandons what it's doing. Right, guys?
They're in agreement with you on this one, Alison.
So, I must say, Capri made a comment. Although tax accountants and lawyers help people to comply, they have no economic value. Thank you, Damien. So with the changes coming and looking work soon.
Okay, Omar had a question.
One more, one last.
We can't work. All the way back.
Thank you. I just need to declare, first of all, I came this afternoon to see Dr. King's PowerPoint presentation, and he didn't disappoint me, so it was very good. So that's the first thing I came about. Now, the other thing I must say is that I was a little bit disappointed in the presentation in that it didn't give an analysis of the different categories of taxes. So my understanding is, and you all can correct me, you have the tax deductible and tax deferred category, you have the tax-free, you have the taxable, and then you have the exemptions. So it would have been good to see who falls, how many of the working population or those over age 18 fall into those categories, because those categories include a high element as well of social insurance. And what I have found from my own experience is that a lot of people, when they start work in Jamaica, haven't got a clue. So they look at everything as a tax rather than seeing it, as you said, benefits and the payments of tax for the good of the whole country. And I think we have to stop seeing tax as a negative. It's a positive. Because if the taxes were not paid, or if we didn't get the tax deductible benefit and the tax-free benefits, a lot of us couldn't be here like myself. So I think we need to be a little bit more holistic. I'm not denying some of the points that you've made, but we need to be a little bit more holistic in how we present the income tax system of Jamaica, and it's very good. It has a lot of good benefits in it, but most people don't know. So I beg you.
So Sidemian, the tax people have used.
Excuse me, sorry, the person said like what? There's 20% of your gross pay that you can take out and contribute to a superannuation fund or retirement scheme. That is in addition to whatever is the percent, I think it's 2.5% for an employee for the NIS benefits. But a lot of people don't know, and they don't even know that NHT contributions are tax-free. You pay for it with after-tax dollars, and when you get the benefit, you pay no tax on it. Same with the life insurance. So I think we got to say what are the good things and what are the better things in it, so you give a more holistic view. So when people leave here, they feel, yeah, man, let me go and pay more into that because everybody will benefit, yeah? Thank you.
So basically, you're telling me not to give up my job after he told me I'm useless.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go back to Slido, and Paul Hanworth has a question that has been voted up. Paul, you want to say your question out loud? Shamoy.
So great presentation, Damien. Thank you. One of the questions I wanted to ask is, did you consider the level of complexity in the various rules when looking at tax evasion? And, you know, just as an example, I recently bought the latest edition of that Jamaican pink tax book. I can't remember what it's called. But to my horror, it's now almost the same size as the US Master Tax Guide. This seems completely out of whack. Our rules are way too complex, and let's, you know, can we please simplify them? And I'd love to hear your comments.
Fortunately, the last time Capri did work on taxation, it was on precisely that issue. It was on the cost of compliance, and we included a raft of recommendations on how to increase compliance, and one of those recommendations was to simplify the rules to make it easier for people to know what their liability is, and secondly, to make it easier to pay. We discovered that a significant number of persons are non-compliant not because they are avoiding the tax liability, but they are afraid of coming into the complexity of the tax code, that even with the best of intentions and the will to be compliant, they are going to be found in violation of some of the rules and then be visited with penalties, and they find themselves at fault. They're afraid of the complexity. So it is a real issue. We made recommendations in that regard, and that was the study in which we found that nearly all of our recommendations were matched by initiatives already underway at Tax Admin Jamaica.
Damien, I can say that we, at the Ministry of Finance, we recognize that, yes, the tax rules can be a bit daunting and cumbersome. That's why we are still working towards simplifying the tax system. We're working with our international partners, the IMF, the World Bank, in streamlining the taxes, in streamlining the penalties and interest to reduce them. So in terms of what our work plan looks like for next year, I just told you, that's the aim, to reduce the interest penalty and further streamline and simplify the tax structure as we have it.
I'd like to add, in terms of TAJ, we recognize that there's a need to look at developing what we call a customer-centric environment. And coming out of that, we have recognized that there needs to be a greater focus on public education. And a part of the trust is to ensure that, one, we understand our customers. And that's why we implement on an annual basis a customer service survey in which we get feedback in terms of how is that we can make our systems better. And one of the recommendations that have come out of it, which we have adopted, that is the Q-matic system and the Q-logic system. We have also seen the need to look at how is it that, for example, our taxpayer assistance program, that we try to build on that. We have seen, for example, that there is what we call persons who have benefited from more than one threshold. We have a threshold abuse program in which we try to put in place a public education campaign for GCT, also to advise persons in terms of how is it that they do their filing when and what are the requirements. Again, so we realize that there is a need to look at public education as well as trying to simplify our forms and try how we can make the system much more user-friendly.
We have a question on Slido from Alex. Alex, where are you? Okay.
Hi, good evening. So I recall that some time ago there was a white paper that was led by Joseph Matalon, and it was to address some tax reform issues. So I don't know if that paper has been lost in history, but I don't know if you could speak to any of the recommendations that were made in that report and the extent to which any of the recommendations have been implemented to date.
Well, Pam, all right, so it depends on which Matalon report. There was one, we've had a lot of reforms. So, Roy Collister did one in the 80s, then there was another one. One of the issues you need to realize too is every time a report comes out, if you don't move immediately, it's useless very quickly because the world is moving. So I'm not sure which of the ones you're speaking about because Damien referred to a comprehensive reform that occurred with regards to changing, some of the tax systems. So one of the things that occurs when we do these reform papers, they are recommendations, and some of them are taken, some are not. Some of the issues that we have, because we have the IMF and we have certain agreements, not all of them move as fast as they should. So when it comes to tax reform, we need to be, the reports that were done in the past, especially with digital transformation, with what we've explained with the change in the world, we need to ensure that the reform makes sense for now and the future of tax. Because it makes no sense to reform now, and suddenly we're all robots, or we're using robots, and therefore we're taxing. So in terms of the Matalon Committee, I was on one of them, and some of the reforms were taken, some were not, some are obsolete now, some of them are still relevant. In fact, the overarching was asking for a comprehensive review to be done at the same time to do a one-shot approach. That hasn't happened. But I will say that because of the pace of changes with the OECD, with our international competitors, because people are competing for where to put their dollars in terms of investment, and things that you used to be able to give as an incentive, you can no longer do. So in terms of tax reform, it's something fluid, and as a country, one of the things we need to watch is not putting in place things that are obsolete very quickly, because when I was growing up, there was no internet. When I started out, the brick phone was fancy. Now we're on this. By the time I'm older, and in a few years, I'm not sure if robots will be sitting and staring at me and if we'll be stick handling them. So we need to make sure that our tax reform is as forward-thinking as possible.
Okay.
So, Pam, you can say what went in, but that's just my ask.
Okay, as Alice has said, the papers can be dated. What we have been doing over time, since I've been with the Ministry of Finance, yes, some of the recommendations made by the Matalon Committee was put in place, but we have been working with our international partners, the IDB, the IMF, the World Bank. We have had several technical assistance reports that have looked at Jamaica's tax system, where we are, where we should be, and we're working with our international partners to ensure that we stay ahead of the curve. And I can say that when we were putting in legislation in 2013, 2014, we were way ahead of our Caribbean neighbors. Now they're looking to Jamaica because Jamaica has made that leap. And where we are, they want to catch up to where we are. And there is still a lot more in terms of tax policy that we can do, but we're working with our international partners as we move along.
Okay, Horace, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. Well, one question is that, one point is that some people have deeper pockets than others. and those with the shallower pockets, the people with lower income, the items, the basic items, whether it's food or furniture or appliances, hurt those with lower income much more than people with the deeper pockets with more money. And in that respect, therefore, GCT is unfair to them, it would seem to me. In other words, it's heavier. GCT imposes, which is on everybody, but it imposes on those with less income a higher percentage of their income than on those with a greater income. And therefore, it would seem to be less equitable for those who earn less. And secondly, the other question was to do with PATH. I mean, while it's better than nothing, the PATH benefits are really pathetically small. Pathetically small. And if that's supposed to be the great benefit coming out of taxes, the GCT and everybody, then I don't see it as much of a success.
Horace, thank you very much for that question. For those two questions that are really the same question, because those two questions are the perfect example of the point the presentation wanted to make. First of all, GCT. We did a rough calculation some time ago of the tax expenditure on zero rating basic food items. The tax expenditure is the amount of tax revenue foregone from the zero rating, from the exemption. And our calculation was that non-poor households received 90% of the benefit from zero rating items. So I want you to imagine that you have a social program that is designed to benefit the poorest households. You know, maybe you are distributing school uniforms. And some investigative reporter discovers that 90% of the school uniforms are going to wealthier households, are being leaked to households in Barbican and Cherry Gardens. It would be a scandal and the program would be shut down. But we are using much more before the reforms, but we were using the tax code for a welfare benefit for which the leakage to non-poor households was too great. The whole point of shifting to more efficient tax collection is because you are right. Our ability to fund the PATH program, which is extremely well targeted as far as welfare programs go. Okay? There are no households in Cherry Gardens and Barbican and Beverly Hills that are on the PATH program. The problem with the PATH program is only that its reach should be expanded and the benefits should be increased by a multiple. If we, in fact, shift to more efficient taxation, the amount of additional revenue can accomplish what both you and I want, which is to have a well-targeted program be properly funded and be of real benefit to people. Because you're right, at the present levels, even with the last increase, it's still pathetic.
I'm going to take one more question from Diana. She had two questions and a comment in Slido. Diana? Yes.
Thank you. Good evening. So my question, I think I have three questions. One is about implementation schedule. As Ms. Spirit said earlier, reports that are not actually put in use immediately become obsolete. So this report and the findings will become obsolete quite soon if we don't have like timelines. So in 10 years' time, are we expecting to see income tax at say 5% and GCT at 30%? We should have something tangible. And the other thing is, it was mentioned that I think churches are exempt from taxes, property taxes, and churches use street light. They benefit from the same thing as all of us, so I don't see why they're exempt. And what was the other question?
You're getting Damien very excited.
There was
Just a
there was a
comment.
mention about NHT not being a tax. Now, I personally don't see the benefit to me. The max is 5.5 million. A studio in Kingston is 17 million minimum. I don't want to pay. I want to put my money in something more profitable. Can I stop paying NHT legally?
Damien, I'll give you a first go, and then Mrs.
I don't think that was a question for me.
There was not a question.
No.
There was, I don't think that. How about in response to your question, can you stop paying NHT legally? The answer is no. In response to your question that churches use,
Why are churches exempt?
why are churches exempt? The question you could also ask, why are charitable organizations exempt? But they're exempt because they're providing a social good. So in the same vein, churches are exempt. On the other matter, the implementation, as I said earlier, in terms of moving from direct taxation to indirect taxation, Jamaica has been moving since 1991, and we have made a more radical shift in the year 2016, 2017 onwards, where we increased the PAYE threshold, providing more disposable income to be used to purchase goods and services, which becomes taxable for GCT. So Jamaica, we are moving in that direction. In terms of the social spend, in terms of path, yes, Jamaica, we recognize that we need to do more, but we still need to put in the right checks and balances to ensure that the correct persons, the right persons, receive the benefit. And we are taking steps towards that.
We do actually have to wrap up now, so we're going to ask each of you to give a 1 to 2 minute final parting thoughts on what we've talked about here and moving forward. We do have refreshments, and we will be able to talk with each other afterwards.
Guys, we gotta respect her. The part of the problem is we have a gentleman at the back that wants to speak, so if you speak, we're gonna have war. So,
Alison, could you give your...
So guys, I'm doing what the moderator says, otherwise you're gonna kick me off the platform, so I'll talk fast. With regards to the
You
takeaway.
have a minute or two.
Yeah, man. With regards to the takeaway, I think it's a good initiative for us to have the dialogue and to hear from people with regards to what the views are and what the issues are. One of the things that we have to be careful, we are in a global world, and some of the, I will take advantage if the tax laws are bad. So you need to ensure that whatever changes we do are forward-looking, are equitable, are fair, and whether it's a PATH program or whatever program, it is done properly, apolitically, so poor people get it, not regardless of where they're from. And I think we should be looking at a tax system, as I said earlier, for growth. We need a country of financially literate people. So part of the initiative in our education system is perhaps to push more financial literacy so that our children can be giving us ideas of what to do with tax reform. Finally, I'm imploring us to look digital. Europe is going that way. We need to start to wake up and realize that taxing paper is going to go out the window. And as a country, somebody has to pay. So one of the things that we need to ensure is that we're not on the informal side and that we all play our role to ensure and we hold people, the government and ourselves to task to to comply. But at the same breath, we ought to get what we pay for.
All right.
Okay,
Tax reform over the years have been a critical part of government's policy for decades. And as we move into the next 10 years, the next 2 years, we have to be looking at what is new. What is new is the digital economy, the Netflix, the Ubers. How do we design tax policies to capture the taxes that are paid? These are things that we now have to start looking at for the future. So as we move into the next year, the next 2 years, we will be looking at these things in terms of how do we improve the tax system that will be moving from direct to indirect taxation.
Again, I want to say I'm very grateful to be here on behalf of TAJ. For me, the takeaway this afternoon is we have seen the importance to place focus on trying to bring persons into the formal setting. And I think what is good in terms of how we have been operating as an organization is very good because we have expanded our e-payment options, our online filing options. And for us, it's very good that we are moving that direction, as we alluded to the digital economy, with the on-filing and with the e-filing options. I was just looking at upgrading our IC infrastructure because very recently we have identified the need to look at upgrading our infrastructure, to look at a development plan for the organization. So again, this is helping us to move along the path that we are trying to make TAJ the place of choice to do business and to become the world-class tax administration.
Well, let me start with gratitude of my own. Now, tax administration Jamaica bears no responsibility for the claims and conclusions in the report, but the degree to which Mr. Williams' office was cooperative in providing us with information was extraordinary, and we are extremely grateful to them. They have been open with us. Couldn't have done without your support. On behalf of Capri, I would also thank the lead researcher, Shanique Smart, who did an outstanding job in marshalling all the additional researchers and pulling everything together for Capri. Let me end where we started, that the ability to collect taxation is the basis on which civilizations rise and fall, and the basis on which countries successfully become developed and build social capital. So, as much as Ms. Fawkes is correct that we have come a very far way in shifting the burden from income taxes towards value-added taxes, the main recommendation of this report is that given the conditions in Jamaica at present and our objectives, it needs to go further. And one of the principal reasons it needs to go further is that we need to address the sentiment that was raised by Mr. Levy, that the growth that is incipient in Jamaica and the improvements that we see are not going to get very far unless we can fund properly the social needs of Jamaica. And so the tax improvements are critical to being able to do that. And that is how we're all going to go forward together. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to ask Raina to come and just close us out.
As we bring this evening to a close, I would like to thank our moderator and to all our panelists for sharing their knowledge and insight with us. This truly made for a rich discussion. Thank you to our sponsors, the USAID and NIA, and to all the staff of Capri who made this event possible. As always, we also wish to thank our faithful corporate sponsors who support us year after year in our research and advocacy. And of course, I would like to thank you, our audience, for your valuable contributions and for making this evening's event a success. We look forward to your continued support. Do look out for our upcoming events, with the next being the presentation of a recommendation to address the failures of Jamaica's environmental regulatory framework, which will be held on the 28th of November at the Terra Nova. Ladies and gentlemen, if you wish to keep discussion going, you can do so as you partake in some light refreshments provided at the back. Thank you and have a great evening.